reste Bretagne occidentale, et spécialiste de cinéma, et au-delà du cinéma, du genre, et plus spécifiquement de la représentation du masculin. Et donc, il va nous proposer une communication aujourd'hui intitulée Not much of a right on you,
je vais tenter, une fois que j'aurai réussi, à faire démarrer. Hop. Je vais essayer sur Play. Ouais, ça devrait marcher. Hein, mais... Ah voilà, ça y est. Hop. Come here. Do, 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 do. Je crois qu'il y a des amateurs. Okay, this big X makes me a little nervous. Okay, here we go. Okay. Everyone's worst nightmare, the PowerPoint that won't work. Okay, here we go. Through the prism of the serial form, Joy Nolan's Westworld takes the original film's premise of blending the Western and science fiction genres and turns it inside out, drawing the viewer's attention specifically to the process as it happens. Now, this is particularly true in terms of gender construction in series. Okay. Today I'll focus on how Westworld blends gender and genre in new ways, paying particular attention to the deconstruction, and I've added a little D to my title, of female gender norms through the characters of robot hosts Maeve, Clementine, and Dolores. I'll briefly touch on how the limits of hegemonic masculinity are portrayed in the male hosts, guests, and showrunners. Showrunners, by this I mean, not just Nolan, but J.J. Abrams and everyone involved, as well as Dr. Ford as a showrunner within the Westworld narrative. And I'll conclude with some thoughts on how Joy and Nolan use gameplay to keep their audience in and aware of the loop. A lot of what I'm going to say you've heard in part before. What I'm focusing on specifically is how conscious Westworld makes us of the way it works. It's continually drawing our attention to look, see what I did there, look at that. And to me, this has a real resonance when it comes to gender construction and deconstruction. Where am I? Now, Pygmalion text, so text where a male creator tries to build a perfect woman who then turns on him, causing chaos, something like what we see in Metropolis, only to be destroyed in the end, those are hardly new to science fiction. Nor is the figure of the male robot, or android, or cyborg intent on destruction, this kind of killer cowboy, that's something that's not rare in cinema either, or gaming, or television. Now, where robots represent the other and humans represent the norm, we often find narratives where the real monsters aren't the ones coming off assembly lines, they're the ones wrapped in human skin and with beating hearts. That's a kind of a cliche reading of robot genres. Similarly, the Western genre is full of easily recognizable gender tropes, and we see them here as well. One good man who stands up against evil, usually then he rides away. The cold-hearted desperado, the cowardly townsman who may or may not experience a burst of courage, the sweet homestead maiden, or the hooker with a heart of gold. Now, Westworld intermingles all these tropes, but with a twist. By first filming host narrative arcs and not human arcs, using familiar cinema techniques, drenched colors, swelling music, extreme high and low angle shots, for example, it places the viewer firmly in the uncanny valley, that space where clear boundaries between humans and robots dissolve, leaving a firm sense of dis-ease. And I would say that the dis-ease that we feel in the uncanny valley of Westworld is particularly sneaky. It's not the same thing we notice when there are clear movements, robotic movements in an android or a cyborg figure. It's more the way we catch ourselves getting caught up in the narrative and forgetting from time to time that we're dealing with non-human figures. Okay. Viewers' engagement with the host mirrors that of certain humans, William the guest, for instance. Cutting between storylines in the park and those in the labs of Westworld unsettles viewers, catching them up each time they allow themselves to get caught up in the park's narratives. In more concrete terms, when the virginal homesteader's daughter and the hooker with the heart of gold are robots, repeatedly dumped off at the lab to be repaired, rebooted, and sent back into the park, a blurring of gender and genre inevitably occurs. Now, this approach underscores two essential elements in the deconstruction of gender. First, we get a play-by-play demonstration of Butlerian performativity through the use of repetitive story loops, intercut in such a way as to underscore the audience's awareness of them. Second, the minute examination of the workings of a created hegemonic space, such as the park, proves Vertese's view that technology does not change a social environment, but instead strengthens and enforces pre-existing gender roles. And that's what we're going to see in Westworld, both the park and the series. Now, while this is certainly true of the robot hosts in Westworld, this reinforcement can also be seen in the portrayal of the human workers and guests in the Westworld universe. Now, in order to explore that interplay between technology and reinforcing gender roles, I want to talk about the quotation in my title, "Not much of a rind on you." Just play you a little bit of this, if it works. So there we have it. Now, of course, the primary meaning of Clementine the whore's catchphrase is that the person she's addressing is new to the place, green, he's not yet hardened, not much of a rind on you. And there's even a sense of you don't smell too bad, as opposed to some cowboys. In other words, he, or in one instance, she, doesn't have much of a hardened surface. You know, a kind of that cowboy boiled leather outer core. It's interesting that Clementine, a creature bearing the name of a fruit, which also has a rind, and who, as we'll see, suffers repeated penetrations of this rind, would use this particular line to approach her clients, be they human or host. Now, tellingly, the Oxford English Dictionary also defines rind as either the skin of an animal or a person, or as an exterior or outer covering, a boundary which keeps you from seeing the inner. Clementine's remarks suggest that in Westworld, it's possible for hosts to get beyond the rind to uncover what's under the outer covering. And there will be a further use of this same expression, not much of a rind on you, several times in the course of the series. And we'll take a look at one a little bit later. Now, in his study of white masculinity, taking it like a man, David Savin points out how fictional texts can actually articulate hegemony. And this is Savin. Indeed, fictional texts, I believe, are particularly important for the production of hegemony, representing sites at which a wide range of ideologies and values can be visualized, reaffirmed, and challenged. In the case of Westworld, fictional texts are multiplied. The TV series itself operates as a fictional text, containing within itself multiple fictional texts which all explore hegemony. Most notably the park, or is it parks, we'll see, created for guests to live out their fantasies, but also the fictional text implanted, altered, and updated in the hosts. The challenge to hegemony comes up, or if challenge there is, because I would argue there's not much of a challenge there, but the demonstration of hegemony comes not only from within each of these fictional texts, but also from their interplay. Now we see this process at work with three of the female robots in Westworld, Dolores, Clementine, and Maeve. Now, Dolores, who's the oldest host in the park, is continually shown following the path set out for her by others. She quotes Shakespeare in Alice in Wonderland. She repeats the same phrase about, ironically, I got it, choosing to see the beauty in the world and of her life having a purpose. Choice of the word choice is very telling there. And she talks about how this path will lead her to love. The path will lead you back to me. to her future. Additionally, throughout season 1, we see Dolores being guided along various paths, and we've heard this a couple of times today, in and out of the park by a number of male figures, be they host, human, or showrunner, in this case, Dr. Ford. She's the character most closely associated with the secrets of the maze, a maze she will only learn to unravel through physical and emotional pain. Whether or not this pain has led or will lead Dolores, whose name literally means pain, to claim agency remains to be seen, as the independence of her final actions in season 1 remains subject to debate. I'm not so sure we can talk about free will there. Now, another female robot, more specifically gender-coded as an instrument, is Clementine. Utilized within the park narrative, she also becomes instrumentalized by the human female members of the Delos administration as a tool to question the hegemony of the park's male creator, Dr. Ford, and his assistant, Bernard. In the following clip, I want you to watch the way power is gendered in the exchange among the humans on one side of the glass, and how Clementine's signature, not much of a wind on you, takes on a more menacing meaning here.
As we look at that, I say, of course, one that has totally for the purposes of this relationship as we can. And as you can see here, those safeguards are operating exactly as you would expect. Miss Ellen, okay, do this again. Okay.
Take a look at the way this shot is laid out. So the scene operates on many levels. The sudden unprovoked violence shocks the viewer, and it did. I watched you guys. Clementine's short-lived revenge is cathartic, but scripted, a calculated means to an end. It's worth noting as well that from the park's point of view, Clementine's appropriate response is the first one, the one as victim. In a more subtle way, verbal exchanges among the humans reveal a gender power structure as well. Dr. Ford's remarked when he first comes in that someone of Charlotte's insight and status should not need further, referring to her reflection in the glass, underscores his patriarchal bias against this woman in power, as does Bernard's reaction. Remember, Bernard's a robot, to the meeting itself. Rather than shattering the glass ceiling, the final shot here implies more of a shattering of the walls between female robot and human roles, specifically maybe female human. Let's not forget that the season doesn't end well for either Teresa or Charlotte, probably Charlotte. I'd add, in addition, there's an interesting interplay in terms of actors, white actors and actors of color as well, both on the human side and the robot side. And if you notice, Charlotte's outfit is almost exactly the same as the outfit that Maeve will wear when she decides to make her break or not. So there's a lot happening there as well. Now, Maeve Mullen is literally another story. As a repurposed host whose initial narrative as mother to a young daughter keeps breaking through the surface of her current skin as a sometimes whore, sometimes madam, Maeve is the first host made aware of her robotic state. Episode after episode, we see her, with the help of her human assistant Felix, altering her own code, quite literally reconstructing her personality and seemingly gaining agency over the narrative itself. While Dolores endures pain and emerges confused by the revelations it subsequently brings, Maeve actively seeks out pain and the subsequent trip to the repair shop it brings, so as to further her transformation. In the following clip, notice how Joy and Nolan overtly expose the constructed nature of the narrative. This is what I want you to look at. From the music on the player piano to the performative verbal cues Maeve gives to change the story. And here I'm talking about linguistically performative. She says it and it happens. Don't recognize it. The piano song that you'll hear is Amy Whitehouse's Back to Black, back in to Black. Yeah. Which, as is Amy Winehouse herself, is a tragic song having to do with love and loneliness and annihilation. But it's an interesting choice for this scene where we think we should be seeing Maeve coming into her own, being, as she says, in charge of her own fucking story.
Anthony took the other girls and took the newcomers at the far table to the stunning view of the Dane's popular attractions. One house. And whatever, suddenly caught connecting mostly back water down.
Okay. So I talked about how in this particular part of the episode, we're clearly shown everything that's happening here. So I mentioned the music. Also, we see Maeve taking control of her narrative, but only to a certain extent. She can't stop the flashback to her former build as a homesteader with a young daughter. She can, however, within the small circle of her narrative, change what the new Clementine is doing, change what the sheriff is doing, and use familiar phrases from the narrative in a definitely a kind of a gaming kind of a way to influence her story up to a certain point. Now, like Dolores, Maeve follows a predictable storyline here, and it's one that she can control up to a certain point. Now, at first, she may seem to fulfill Sue Short's fantasy of female perfectibility. That's why I call this Maeve's extreme makeover. This idea that she can alter her narrative by making alterations to herself. And yet, at the moment where she has, in fact, managed to escape, following what we find to be another prescribed narrative, she cannot resist her hegemonic coding as a mother, and the daughter she knows is only a construction because she said it. And then seemingly inevitable slide back into traditional female gender norms. Remember I talked about how technology can intensify gender codes and not necessarily subvert them. We'll wait and see what happens in season 2, but it doesn't look like it looks like we're going down a pretty gender normative path. Now, you'll notice that I spent little time on human females in the series. This is in part because there are very few of them. And by the end of the season, none of them is left standing, though there's a chance that 2 of them may have in fact survived. There's an interesting dynamic of power with the character of Charlotte, who is kind of the head of Dulles Corporation, in the way she's first introduced to the narrative through a kind of a sexy scene with Sizemore, who makes terrible mistakes. We later see her utilizing one of the androids, abusing one of the androids in her hotel room, sort of without any kind of regret. She's an interesting character, but we can see that her power is definitely limited in this opening season, and it seems like she's constantly being circumvented by Dr. Ford. So let's take a look at the boys. And I'll have to tell you, I had to hold myself back completely not to make some kind of 50 Shades of Grey reference with the black hats and the white hats, but I'm not going to do that. What can we have to say about hegemonic masculinity within the narrative of Westworld? Michael Kimmel says, famous feminist socialist, American sociologist, Michael Kimmel, excellent book, Manhood in America, says, how did the chronic restlessness of the 19th century self-made man, which became the general malaise and discontent of 20th century masculinity, morph into the explosive rage of the 21st century? I think we can all agree we're seeing a lot of that. For one thing, the very adherence to traditional ideals of masculinity now leaves so many of them, meaning white males, feeling cheated, unhappy, and unfulfilled. Thus, traditional codes of masculinity are respected in Westworld, both inside and outside the park. Among the robot population, cowboys, prospectors, sheriffs, and outlaws all adhere to genre and gender codes. Air male robots from objectification at the hand of guests, which we've seen, and the occasional Dallas worker. And we see this with Teddy, Hector, and even Bernard. Now, Dr. Ford, the godlike creature of this creator of this world, acts as a kind of a classic puppet master, pulling on various narrative strings throughout the season, showing at every turn that he is in control, that he's master of his universe, including the way in which he decides to blow it all up. Even his apparent conferring of free will upon Dolores smacks of religious overtones. Still, two characteristics strike me. While in the instance of Logan, who is the brother-in-law of the future brother-in-law of William, there's a kind of gleeful embracing of the hegemony conferred upon him in the park, and he even refers to William as his brother, a brotherhood of hegemony. His remark to his, at one point he even says to Dolores, we're gods here. You exist for our pleasure. For the most part, non-robot masculinity in Delos can be coded in chameleon terms. There's a sense of dissatisfaction, of being cheated. In short, we find here an echo of the generation of seekers so present in the 1970s, and which Guy Jill made reference to this morning. Here, in its more toxic strain, the Man in Black's unrelenting quest for the secret of the maze can be seen as an example of this, feeling cheated, feeling unfulfilled. Much has been made of the hegemony of the Man in Black as the ultimate figure of evil, his cruelty, his sadism. We might notice, however, the weary way he goes about his debauchery. Despite his racial, gender, and financial hegemony, he seems to feel tricked by the game, precisely because it's rigged in his favor. Now, to a lesser extent, ridiculous human male characters like Sizemore, the well-named, the ineffectual narrative creator, and Sylvester, the schlubby white computer tech, seem to buy into hegemonic systems, even as they refuse to confer upon them the power they think they deserve. Note, for instance, the exchanges between Sylvester and Maeve, where he attempts to explain why she's trapped in her coding. Look, we might be able to give you a sense of humor about this, but you're never getting out. Without seemingly realizing that he's equally trapped in his own coding. Interestingly, masculine gender norms are most challenged by figures of color. Arnold/Bernard, and the Asian-featured Felix, the lab tech who helps Maeve reprogram herself. Maeve remarks on this difference when she says to him, "You make a terrible human. I mean that as a compliment." And I think there's a lot of thinking to be done here about how race and gender intertwine in this first season of Westworld, because there's a lot going on there that I'm not going to mention here. Now, I do want to talk briefly about how gender and reception interact here. We've already heard about the influence of video games on the series, especially in terms of the terms used. Characters have different builds, players choose their costumes and their equipment, narratives adapt themselves to player interactions within the strictures of the narrative loop. Also, players can act in a way that they would not in real life, pillaging, raping, killing, etc. Now, in addition, as viewers, our reception of different elements is also conditioned by cinematic codes taken not only from classic Westerns and science fiction films, but also from production choices. And I'm going to leave the intertext to the people after me, but it is true that you can see in certain sequences and certain shots, they're direct quotations from a number of famous films in the Western canon and in science fiction canon. Now, when I'm talking about production choices, I'm talking about things that the showrunners of Westworld have decided to put into place. The names of certain characters, for instance, Dolores, linking her to suffering, but also Dr. Robert Ford, with its links to both John Ford, the godfather of Western cinema, but also Henry Ford, the American industrialist who kind of put together this notion of a society built around mass production. There's also Ford, the godlike figure in Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, a story with numerous links to Westworld, in particular about suffering as a means of raising consciousness and the role of pleasure in keeping societies dormant. Now, in addition, if you look at the choice of actors, and I'm only going to name a couple of the ones that struck me the most, but once you start to go down this road, it's unending. And it depends a little bit on your own personal choices. But if we look at Anthony Hopkins as Dr. Robert Ford, he's instantly recognizable, both as an authoritarian patriarchal figure. I mean, he plays Odin in all of the Thors, the recent Thors, and Hitchcock, so lots of different kinds of authority there. And also as a monster, think of Silence of the Lambs. Thus, when we see him as a shadowy godlike figure in Westworld, it resonates almost like references to past lives coded within us, to our memories of him in those other roles. The same can be said with a number of actors in Westworld. Tandy Newton, Maeve, was previously seen in Crash and in Beloved, playing a similar kind of a figure between, not that similar, but similar between worlds. Jeffrey Wright, who plays Bernard Arnold, is known to many as Beatty from the Hunger Games. And that circular world certainly has a Hunger Games feel to it, as far as I'm concerned. Similar association can be made for each characters, and it becomes another kind of game, another kind of maze to figure out those links. And of course, all of those color our viewing, our reception of the series. Recognizing the instrumentalized versions of popular songs used in key scenes, from Radiohead, the Rolling Stones, Soundgarden, The Cure, Amy Winehouse, also adds a level of gameplay to the reception, as in the case of the scene with Maeve that I just showed, and complexifies the reading of the scenes, often in terms of gender. To conclude, I would just add that through its aesthetic and production choices, incorporating star persona and gaming techniques, as well as knowledge of Western and science fiction genres, Westworld draws specific attention to the ways in which gender is consciously constructed and reinforced, both for the hosts and for the humans. Having demonstrated the socially constructed nature of gender in season 1, it remains to be seen if the series will question these constructions in season 2. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup Beth pour cette mise au point sur la question du genre qui je crois effectivement est centrale dans la série. Donc je laisse tout de suite Thomas continuer la parole à la salle. Est-ce qu'il y a des remarques, des réactions? You mentioned that the name Dolores is synonymous with pain, which is really interesting. And this is a character that's being constantly raped again and again. This is what raises
so much raping.
So much raping that actually made me think of Vladimir Nabokov's character, Lita. Do you think that's linked? Because Lita's real name is Dolores.
I thought of that one, but I mean, I think that when you get into that kind of Bactinian territory, there's no getting out. I mean, that makes perfect sense, I would say. And there, that certainly doesn't go counter to what's being put forth here. You mentioning Dolores and her sort of, although it's it's interesting to see the way those scenes are filmed, because again, it's mostly off camera. We just get ideas, but there's an interesting repetition once Dolores is a bit more woke of those scenes, there's a point where she exactly mimics the movements of the man in black with him, where she grabs him by the head and drags him up the church. And, she follows the exact same repetition, which for me also underscores the kind of the artificial constructive side of gender. She can just as easily take on that persona if that's what comes up in her code. But yeah, I think the name Dolores, does have all kinds of resonance. I know in art, I think there's a certain kind of Virgin Mary that's called the Virgin Dolorosa. Not my territory, but I mean, this and this kind of fetishization of pain, this embodiment of, there's, particularly in that thing. But yeah, I think Nabokov, that makes sense. Have to look a little bit more, but.
Thank you for this focus on the body of the actors, individual bodies of the actors. Sight of intertextuality, the phrase is not mine, but I find it quite useful. Yeah, it's fascinating. This body of actors, a group of actors, and their past lives as actors and previous characters, parts played in previous series or films. It's part of the reception game, definitely.
And I think it's never ending. I mean, that kind of dialogic and conversations like this, if we go back, it did that, we're continually recoding what we see. And you mentioned their bodies. There's a whole sort of paratext around the nakedness in the series, because people are talking about, oh, is Westworld a new Game of Thrones? And there's certainly a lot of naked going on, but it's a different kind of naked. And Tandy Newton in particular has talked about the liberating side of it's shown in Westworld, because it's a kind of a nakedness without shame. It's a completely assumed, invulnerable nakedness in a way. Empowering nakedness. And I think that I like your term, the body of actors, as well, because they do. They cohere as a whole. And when we see them in some other thing, we're going to remember this as well. But you're right. It does color what we're. And I think it's not just, oh, look, there's somebody we already know. It really does kind of feed the way we read.
How difficult it was for her to wear the first from Adam, then to be naked.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Bien, s'il n'y a pas d'autres commentaires, on va laisser les intervenants de la dernière intervention s'installer. Donc, je s'installer.
It's a big question.